the pacing a little bit. And that's definitely not an intentional, like, hey, let's just flow through it. But it is something where, as we continue to adjust the curriculum and the way that the course is laid out, something that's really important is if we do cover something that you would like to kind of slow down on, like please, whether it's in the chat, you can message Veronica, let us know, because the last thing we want to do is not fully cover something, which that is our intention. But as you all know, just things happen. And I definitely am wanting to make sure you can walk away with this and be like, okay, I have a general idea of what's going on, right? And obviously, this is an introduction too. So there are going to be certain things that we are revisiting. And as we continue to build and develop, these skills and these ideas are going to be cemented more. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let me know when you are able to see it. Looks like we're good. Awesome. Okay. So today we are going over the CSS box model. Today is going to be less about applying specific styles like colors, and it's more understanding how CSS can be used to create a web layout. So today's goals, by the end of this lesson, you will be able to understand the components of the CSS box model, apply margins, borders, padding, and content dimensions in CSS, and then use the box model to control the element spacing and layout. As you see here to the right, we have a warm-up. We'll go over some box model components. We'll get into sizing and position. And then we'll take a break at that point, and then we will be going over the lab for the rest of the day. All right. So let's go ahead and do a few warm-up questions. As always, this is a good way to just kind of get ourselves in the mindset of thinking through what we're going to be working on. I know it's later in the day for y'all as well. So let's go ahead and let's do a refresher on some basic web fundamental development concepts. So for the first question, what is a way that CSS can enhance the appearance of elements? And remember, if you do have, if you want to share, let's go ahead and share that in the live chat. And just a reminder, I've got Slack down here on my iPad, so I'm not like looking away. I promise I'm looking here at the chat. All right, so we've got a few people typing. Who's going to be the first? All right, so we can do background colors. We can change fonts. We can change the list styles. That's what we call like deep cut, right? Not something we talked about a lot, but we can absolutely do that. We can change the layout, specific colors, specific fonts. Perfect. So let's think through. The C in CSS, what does that stand for? We have cascading, coding, control, or creative. All right, looks like we have a consensus on A. Yes, so cascading being the way that it's going to cascade down, right? So if you remember, if we set font color to blue for a paragraph tag, and then a little bit later we set the color of a paragraph tag to red, what is it going to be? It's going to be red, right? And it's not just the order, but also based on specificity. It's going to be inheritance. There's a lot of things that will dictate how the CSS cascades, right? And that's just something that you'll learn as you continue to do it more. But if you understand and you remember the C is cascading, then you do remember there's a little bit of science to it, right? Now, which property is used to change the font of an element? Is it font family, font weight, font style, or font size? Okay, looks like everyone in the chat is throwing down an A. Let's see. Yep, it's A. So what's important to remember here being the font family, right? So you can specify the name of the font, but remember you have this fallback too. And a lot of times you don't even necessarily have to set Georgia, right? You could set serif whatever the case may be, because that is technically the family is, serif or monospace, things like that. So just remember that that's where that family part comes in. But yes, we would use font family. So getting into the CSS box model, really it is what we see here, right? It is going to be a box. Now, not all elements are a box, right? Maybe you have a image that's a circle, maybe you have a button, but at the core of everything, all HTML elements are boxes. Okay. And the box model is really what determines the layout and structure of a page and an element. So each box is going to have four different components that we're going to go over, and we're going to start from the middle, the center. We're going to have our content, our padding, our border, and our margin. Okay. And these aren't just like arbitrary values. For example, if I was to go into my developer tools, and if I was to select this image, I can figure out the right way to pull this up. You would see here, I can actually see that, right? So I have the content here, the padding, the border, margin, and we'll get into each of these, but this is something that comes directly from how each and every web page is structured. So the content, the core of an element, is going to be where any text, images, media, right? It's where it's displayed. And we're going to define the content based on the width and the height, right? So whether it's an image, it's text, we can set the dimensions of this component. So as a reminder, as we go through each of these pages and each of these examples, highly, highly, highly recommend, if you are able to, tweak these selectors and these properties, right? So we'll go over it, but like you can go in, make these changes. If you're worried about, oh, I accidentally messed it up, you could just, copy your width, paste it again. You could comment it out, right? But again, these aren't your assignments. So feel free to mess with this. And when you make those changes, refresh so you can see exactly how it works. Sometimes it's easier to see how something works by breaking it and realizing, oh, okay, now I actually see what it looks like when it's not done correctly. So the content component of the box model, again, is going to use your width and your height properties. So we have two examples here. If you look at your HTML, we have two divs, one with a class of pink content box and one with a class of orange content box. The pink content box is given, well, background color of pink. The width is set to 500 pixels and the height is set to 100 pixels. And we see for the orange content box, same thing, right? It's orange based on the class name. And we're going to set the width and the height to 200 pixels. So this is the most basic way to set width and height of an element. Okay, so if I was to go in here and I wanted to change this to 1,000 pixels, right? I could hit refresh and you would see that this would go out of the bounds quite a bit. I'd have to scroll over. That's a pretty long element. There are also other types of units that we could use as well. So I could say here 25 EMs, which I know we haven't got into that, but just remember pixels are not the only thing that we can set here. You can also set it to 75%, right? And it would take up 75% of the width of the parent container like we saw before. So this isn't just for divs. I could have a paragraph tag. Let's throw some lorem ipsum in here. And since this is the only paragraph tag, we can go ahead and do a selector here of paragraph. Do background color. Let's do the green. I'll do a width of, let's do 50 pixels. Let's see how bad that looks. See? So you'll notice some of this stuff is breaking out, right? We haven't got into different CSS styles for word break, but the actual container is 50 pixels. So I could go ahead and set this. Let's set it to just 50%. Same thing. So we see that it's taking up 50% of the container. I could make this page bigger and it still takes up the 50%. So everyone understand here, the content is the actual element that we are styling. Okay, so whether it's an image, it's a text, it's a div container, we are setting the width and the height of the content. Now, padding is going to be the next step up. Okay, so this is going to be the component that surrounds the content area. So think about you are shipping a package. You put whatever you want in the package, right? Whether you're selling an old phone, maybe a game, and then you would pad around it to protect what you're shipping, right? So this is the same way where we are padding the content around the content. So it's a way that helps create some space and also can help improve the readability of the content. Now, this isn't necessarily an accessibility issue in like a screen reader, but it does help in regards to just basic reading. If all the text is just right on top of each other, it's going to be harder for someone to discern different paragraphs, being able to separate out the elements. So here we see that there's 4 different properties that we can use, well, really 5, to control the padding for an element. And it's padding top, right, bottom, left, or you can just set padding, okay? So here, we're going to look at a couple different examples of what padding may look like. So again, we have a couple divs with a class of no padding, small padding, large padding. The no padding, well, we didn't set any padding, right? So everything here, we're looking at all the divs having a width of 300 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. Now, small padding, we are setting padding of 20 pixels on all sides. So what's really important to understand here is there are what we would consider short form property styles, okay? So if you go to MDN, this is a good way to understand how any CSS selector, HTML, we've gone over this, great documentation, but it goes clockwise. So it always starts at the top. So it goes top, right, bottom, left, just like a clock. So in this instance, this is uniform, so it's actually going to be for every single one, okay? But if I was to change this to be 20 pixels, 40 pixels, 0 pixels, and 100 pixels, if I hit refresh on small padding, which betrays the name, but we'll hit refresh. I think it's wondering why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? So we see here it's quite a bit different than what we were expecting, right? So we look here again, top, right, bottom, left. So we have top, right, and then the bottom is, I'm going to have to figure out what is going on with that. Wonder if it cares about the 0 on there. Okay. Go small padding. Oh, interesting. Yeah, it's because it's still setting the height on there. That makes sense. So if you hover over here, you can actually see how the padding works on the element. So you can look, see 20, 40, 0, 100 pixels there. But again, the way we had initially was just the 20 pixels, right? So let's just change that to 40 pixels. I like 40. And then we're setting the uniform on here, but we still have that width of 300 pixels, right? So let's experiment. Let's remove the width and the height, okay? So let's go back into here, what we saw. So 10 pixels. Let's do no padding on the sides, okay? 0 pixels, 10 pixels, 0 pixels, okay? So again, it's interesting how this works because we're not setting a width to the element, so it takes up the full amount, right? So that's where the width and the height are important because all we're doing is setting padding. But if the width is going to be take up the entire thing, then you may not see this padding on the right because it's going to take up that full container. But you can see here, there's no padding on the left, and there's only 10 pixels on the top and the bottom. Does that make sense? Like why we can't just set this to be whatever padding we want. It's all still contingent on the actual sizing of the element as well. So I could go back into here. I could set this to 100 pixels, right? We could have a square. And now you can see 10 pixels up here, right? But since we're still setting the width and the height to 100 pixels, there is a little bit of padding on the top and the bottom, but it's still taking up that 100 pixels for the height. Okay. Do we have any questions before we move on to the next component? Not seeing anything in there. I see Omar's typing. I know, Dragos, you're on your phone. Does padding add up to the box size? So we're going to get into that. Great question. I don't want to spoiler alert, but yes, it does factor into that. It's a great question there. So moving past that, we have our content, we have our padding around it, and then we also have the border. Okay. So the border is going to encapsulate the padding and the content areas. And really, it's just going to be an outline for the element that can be styled. Okay. So you have different properties such as border width, border style, and border color, which I believe I had worked on this previously where we had like dotted borders. It looked kind of funky, right? We see here, actually, we have the dashed border. So even built into that, we see some styling. But we don't have to do individual properties like we did last time, with padding left, padding right. We can also just set border and we can customize everything based that way in a single property. So looking at these three examples, we have a solid border, a dotted border, and a thick border, right? So the first border here, just 2 pixels. So we use the unit of measurement that we'd like to do. So the line width. And then we're going to set the line style, okay? And then we're going to set the line color. Again, with Codio and with VS Code, you can hover over and it'll actually give you the syntax right here. And it'll give you that link to MDN. So if you ever get confused, you can always hover over there. It'll give you that tip, or you can always check out W3 Schools, MDN, and get a refresher on that. Now, there is somewhat of a default, right? So if I was to take out solid black and just hit refresh, well, it's not going to do anything, right? Because we need to make sure that we always have some sort of syntax. So it can't read our mind with this. So that's where we'd want to say, you could do dashed and then red, right? So now it understands what we're doing. But that's where if we just wanted to specify one thing, we could go border bottom, and then I could say 1 pixel solid red. And now I just have a border there at the bottom. Let's change that to 5, make it a little bit more visible. And this comes in handy when maybe you want to design like a card for a website. So for example, one of the projects I worked on here recently, there was different cards for a user to select based on, it was an LLM, and you wanted to choose which company you wanted to view the data for. So we had something along the lines of just like border top 5 pixel solid red, and then I had border radius, I think it was like 8 pixels. So border radius, which we don't really get into in this lesson, will add somewhat of a curve to your element, right? So that's how you'd get like a circle, for example. But the CSS I did actually only did the border radius for the bottom, and then the top was still the square, right? So the border there's a lot of customization you can do with it. It's not just, okay, let's add a set of lines around the entire element. We can just do top, we could do bottom. As we learn about different pseudo classes, we could have a hover right? Where the border only appears when you hover. But again, what we're seeing here is we have the border property, and then we're adding 2 pixels dotted green or 4 pixels solid blue. So it's going to be the line width, the style of the border, and then we're going to have the color. Is everyone tracking so far? And it says, does border inherent color value of the content? So again, that's where we would have to set the color, right? But good question. Can I use multiple classes IDs for the same element? Yeah, you can have as many classes as you want. Now, again, we don't want to really set multiple IDs, right? So you think about an element where if its ID was solid, it wouldn't really make sense to have solid and then pizza and tacos. As you can tell, I'm hungry. I'm always hungry. This is hard to do over lunch. But an ID would just be for one element, right? Now, class, for example, we could do solid border. We could do hard element. We could do hero. We can add multiple classes to a single element. So then here, I could do dot hard element. Let's do box shadow. Let's do 2 pixels. You're not even really going to be able to see that. Yeah, I'm not going to mess too much with that. But yeah, you could add multiple styles or different classes to a single element here. So again, great question. When you get into things like Tailwind, for example, you'd see this pretty often. When you get into enterprise code too, you will see multiple classes on a single element almost consistently, based on just what you're trying to do and standardizing different elements. Okay. So last here, we're going to have the margin. So we started with the content. We add some padding around the content. We want to add a border to the actual content, right? Now, something to keep in mind is even if the border isn't visible, the border is still there. Okay. So that is something where you can always add that, but that border is always existing. It's always a property that's going to be there. You could set 0 pixels, but that just means the border is not visible. But there's always going to be some sort of box around the padding and the content. Now, the margin, what happens is now you're not actually changing the size of the element. Now, what you're doing is you're creating space between this element and other elements. Okay, so margins are invisible. They have no background color, completely transparent. So it's either like the edge of the window, or maybe you want to push other elements away from this element. That's where you can create some spacing between different elements. That's where we start seeing more layout-based structuring, okay? And again, like we saw last time, we have margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left. This is giving us an idea we're working clockwise, but we can just use the single property of margin, so you can set all 4 properties in a single statement. So looking here, we have a small margin, large margin, and mixed margin. So what I'd like to do is comment out all of this code, okay? So let's look at this if there is no margin. Now, we see here, we have padding, right? We actually added some padding to the entire page. So if I comment that out, everything is pretty in here. But then you're like, oh, wait, where's this padding coming from? Well, it's because we actually added some padding in the divs, right? And then we have, let's see here, we've got a width that we've set, right? So if we pretty much, I kind of want to base all of this out here. We have 100% for all of our containers, right? And then we have no padding inside of here. If I was to inspect this page, you would see, let's go down here to styles. There's really nothing here at all, right? Here's the actual content and no padding, no border, right? So let's go ahead and add some of this back in. We'll add the 20 pixels of padding around the page. I'm clicking here in the body. You can see that the padding now exists, right? So I can toggle this to demonstrate how that actually looks. That's one of the benefits of using the element inspector is you actually don't have to change any CSS files, is you can go in and change this in real time. So I could go here to 20 pixels. I could set this to 50 pixels, and I could look at what that would, or I could see what that would look like without actually having to change my code, which is very, very handy. Now, you'll see here, we actually have some margin that's already built in. And this is what I wanted to show you is there is some style that Codio is injecting where there is an automatic margin of 8 pixels. Okay, so this isn't something I can go in here and edit. It says user agent style sheet. So that's really important to remember is if you're noticing like, wait, why? Like I still have some margin here. What's going on? It's because there's actually another style sheet that's being applied there. So if we remember the important tag, right? So if I was to go here, I go margin 0 pixels important. And then I remove this padding. Now there's no padding at all. That looks really bad, right? But that point being is sometimes you will have CSS that's being applied to your file, and there's not really a way to control that because of where you are developing. So in this instance, that's where the important might come into play. So now I can set a padding of 20 pixels, hit refresh, and arguably, I think that looks better, right? It's an actual 20 pixels. So getting back into the margin, I wanted to show a little bit on the developer tools here. Let's go and uncomment the padding and the width. So right here, we see everything scrunched up together. So let's go ahead and add that 5 pixels of margin back to the small margin element. So now, if I was to use my developer tools, and here on the small margin, you can see there is 5 pixels up top, to the right, to the bottom, and to the left. And to make that even more visible, I could go in here, change that to 0. And now you can see everything's actually lined up here on the left, but it's got the margin here on the bottom, to the right, and up top. Okay? And if I uncomment all of these now, we'll see what all these styles are actually doing is the margin is pushing the elements away from each other in a particular fashion based on what we're saying. So if we wanted to refactor this here, margin top, right, bottom, left, if we wanted to have it in a single property, how would we do that? Can someone throw that on the chat or give it a try first, right? If you're not sure, try it in Codio, see what happens. But what would it look like if we wanted to just have a single line to do these 4 properties or these 4 styles? All right, let's see if that works. Margin. Dragosh put something here in the chat. 200 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, 200 pixels. Okay. We'll comment that out. Hit refresh. Yep, it looks the same. So again, this is where if you want to, it kind of makes sense to put everything in a single line, especially if you are going to do all 4 of them. Right now, if you're only going to set margin for one, you could do margin top, right? Especially if you can't remember offhand which way you're going. Now, something that's really handy to understand is if you want the top and the bottom to be the same, or the left and the right to be the same, I could actually just set this to be 200 pixels and 20 pixels. And it's going to be a little different, but what this is saying is top and bottom will be 200, and then left and right will be 20. Okay, so you can do shorthand too, but that only works if they're going to be the same on top and bottom, left and right. Okay. What questions do we have, or are we ready to move on past the margins? You don't see anything in their chat. Should be good to go. Awesome. So now we're going to get into box sizing. And Dragos, this is what you had asked before. So box sizing is going to be how the actual dimensions of the elements are calculated. So should the padding and the border actually be included, or should it be added on top of that element size? Now, let's go ahead and talk about the two different concepts that we have. Okay, so we have content box and then border box. So content box is only going to include the content itself. Okay, so padding and border will actually be added on top of that. So as we see here, we have the content, but then padding and border are not included. So if your content was 200 pixels, your padding was 20 pixels, and your border was 1 pixel, you would have to add the padding on both sides and the border on both sides for the width, right? And we'd have to do the padding up top and the border to factor in the height. Now, if we wanted to do border box, that's going to actually factor in all that for us. Okay, so even though this is just showing us the width, it would be the same thing for the height. We'd have to take the content, add it to the padding, and add it to the border as well. So let's figure that out. So if we had content that's 200 pixels wide, and our padding was 10 pixels on both sides, and then our border was 1 pixel on each side, what would be the width of the content? And I'll throw that in the chat again. So we have 200 pixels for the content. We have 10 pixels on each side for the padding, and then 1 pixel on each side for the border. And we have a couple answers in the chat. Yes, it would be 222. We take the 200, add 10 and 10, 1 and 1, and we'd get 222 pixels wide. Great job, everyone. So to make this more tangible, we can take a look here in our IDE. Okay. So as always, we have a couple different examples based on the classes. So with the content box, we are actually setting the box size into content box. Okay. So if I was to change this, and I recommend you doing the same thing, change box sizing to border box, you'll notice the size is going to be the same, right? We are actually specifying here how we want the element to be sized. Now, I will speak from experience that I don't use this very regularly. It's not that it's not important, but this is something where depending on how you style everything, you may not need to change this, but it's still important to understand because I do see this in other projects. I do see this in other places. So it's important to understand what the differences are. So again, in the content box, the 200 pixels is only going to apply to the width itself. So now if we have a padding of 20 pixels, now we take that 40 pixels of padding, because we have 20 on each side, and since the border is 5 pixels, we take 10 pixels total, because it's on each side, and we get 250 pixels. So to make this a little bit more visible, maybe, let's set the padding to 2 pixels. Okay. So now our width is 200. Our padding is going to be 4 pixels, and then our border is 10 pixels. So it's still bigger than the other one, right? The other one is going to be constrained to that 200 pixels. But it's not quite as drastic as what we saw previously when the padding was 20 pixels total. Okay. So again, in contrast, that border box for the box sizing means 200 that we set here, the width, that's going to be everything. Okay. So if we want to confirm that that's actually the case, I always recommend opening up our developer tools here. We can highlight over the element. So I can see here, I've got the class of content box, the class of border box, so I can look at the two. So let's click on this bottom one here, right? So we can actually see how everything is broken down to make this work. So we have a content that's roughly 151 pixels wide, and then we have 20 pixels, and then we have a border that's actually 4.5 on each side. So it will actually constrain down as closely as possible for that to work. If I was to change this to 4 pixels, hit refresh, you see now we still have the 20 pixels padding, right? The content itself changed a little bit, but now the border is 3.75. That's kind of something you have to be aware of is if you are using the border box, just because you're setting the border size, for example, it will, like, it still technically is correct, but when you get into the actual fine details, you'll see that it's 3.75 pixels, not 4 pixels. I doubt that will ever be a major issue, but just again, being aware, it rounds up to 4 pixels. It's just not exactly 4 pixels there. Okay, so what I want to do here, Yvonne, can we go ahead and, or anyone throw up a poll in the chat? I want to see how everyone's feeling. I know we've moved from HTML to CSS. So before we get too much further here, just really trying to do a temperature check because we want to make sure we've got a solid grasp of where we're at.
Yeah, I can launch that really quickly.
Awesome.
Folks, you will see it pop up on your screen right now.
And this has encouragement too. I feel like a broken record every time I say this, but it's the same thing with my associate engineers I mentor is there is never an expectation that it's like, oh, I just completely know everything about this, right? I've never met anyone who could sit through something like this and like, boom, boom, yeah, I'll never have to think through this again. But what we don't want to see is anyone who might feel like, I don't get this at all, right? If that ever gets to that point, we want to make sure we're stopping and reiterating what we're working on. So it looks like we have at least 2 votes to revisit some concepts. So if you could throw that in the chat, or you could at least see, or at least let Veronica know what you would like to see revisited, we can make sure to include a little bit of that at the end. Okay, so it looks like we have 3 votes there. So let us know what you'd like to revisit, and we'll make sure we can do that as we have some time to work on the lab at the end. Okay. Perfect. Thank you all for that. So now we are going over position. And what I want to state here is these properties are super important. But as we've started developing new tools such as Flexbox and CSS Grid, you'll find that these are still important, but maybe not as utilized as they have been in the past. That is not me saying we don't need to learn about them, but if there's something that's really not clicking, once we get into our next lesson over Flexbox, I think it'll make a lot more sense. So as before, if you're not tracking, let us know, but really let's just kind of focus here on the overall idea of how we're changing an element position, less about the specific ones that we're talking about. So when it comes to position, you're going to have a default property, and that's called static. Okay, so this is really just your basic top to bottom. You want to put something on your page, the position is going to be static. So we see here, if you look at our HTML, we have 4 elements. One has a class of static box. Okay. Static box, the class, all it's doing is setting a background color of light blue and setting the position to static. So if I was to remove this class, I hit refresh, literally nothing changes, right? This is a basic property. So it's, I will say it's one of these things where you're probably never going to have to set something to static unless the position is set otherwise. And if you want to, as we'll learn, there's conditional rendering. There's we can have pseudo classes. So maybe you have something that is a position of absolute, and based on a condition, now you want it to be position static. That would be an instance where you would use that, but otherwise, static is default. So it's not something that you would have to add for a typical basic element. Okay. Now, relative, this is where we're going to have some fun with this. Okay. So a relative element is going to stay in the flow. Okay. So we're going to see some positions that will disrupt the flow, but this one's going to stay in the flow. But any adjustments we make are going to be relative to the original position. Okay. So what we can do is top, right, bottom, left, like we saw before. And now what will happen is as we move this element, other elements aren't going to adjust accordingly, right? They're not going to fill that space just because we moved the relative element. But as always, a lot easier to actually take a look and figure out how this works. So here we have this relatively positioned box that is awkwardly placed. And that's because we've changed the position to relative. And we are changing the top positioning down 30 pixels from where it was originally. And we're moving it to, from the left, 60 pixels. So let's go ahead. What I'd like to see is let's take 30 seconds or so, maybe even a minute. Let's come up with some really weird positioning for this element. And let's throw some screenshots into the chat, see what you're able to come up with. What I'm going to do is I want bottom 75 pixels. I want my right to be 120. And that is incredibly awkward, but that's the point, is where it was originally. If I uncomment the relative, we'll see where it's at. So if I do this right, I'm expecting this element to get pushed 120 pixels from the right and 175 pixels from the bottom. Okay. So has anyone tried anything in their Codio? Just to kind of get a feel for what's actually happening here. Yep, you like almost completely covered over the other element. That's awesome. Thanks, Omar. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how this works. Again, I feel like this tends to be more of a reactive thing where you may have some logic that plays out and then the element gets moved around. I don't use it a lot personally, but I have seen it very often, especially if you want to layer different elements too, right, to create something new. Zartasha, I saw you shared. Yep, relative all the way down there in the bottom right. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yep, and Timo there in the middle. Yeah, that's awesome. Great work, everyone. So again, if you wanted to use the element inspector, you could go in here, right, and change this to whatever you wanted. I cannot stress this enough. It's so much easier to try things in the developer tools like this compared to like constantly refreshing my CSS on my page, right? And just something too, I don't think we've talked about this, but if I select an element right? So let's select this first div that says another element for comparison. And where did he go? Whoops. Okay, so select this here. I can actually add a new style. So it doesn't have to be editing. You don't have to edit an existing style. So now I could say border radius 64 pixels, right? So now we have this like pill looking element. And it's because I selected this element and I added that style. So what's handy for this is as you start learning CSS, maybe you have an idea, but again, you don't want to refresh your entire page or your application. Well, now I could go in there and try that out and be like, not really what I want. I could unselect it, right? I could delete it. And what's nice is if you do like it, you can right click, do copy property, and then I could go in here. I could do that property that I want, right? There's all these different things you can copy. Copy declaration that should copy the entire thing. Then now I go in, right? And I like that style. So now I can just throw that into my IDE. So again, cannot stress it enough. Developer tools are there for a reason and very, very helpful. Okay. So now we have absolute. So absolute is removed from the flow entirely, right? So it's not going to affect placement of other elements. It doesn't occupy any space in the layout whatsoever. Again, we can do top right, bottom left. And as you've noticed, we're continually doing the clockwise format here. Okay. Now, the absolute positioning is really helpful for things like pop-up messages, right? Or maybe we want to have a very specific element based on that page where think about a application and maybe you have a not just a header, right? Like a nav bar, but maybe you have like a little badge that you want specifically on that nav bar, a little icon, but it doesn't fit that normal flow. That would be really helpful, right? To use that absolute positioning. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how we can figure this out. So this here, similar to what we had before, is we are adjusting it 30 pixels from the top and 60 pixels from the left. And this is going to be from its closest positioned ancestor. So in this instance, if we look here at the HTML, that's going to be the body tag. Okay. So what's really handy for this is understanding that it doesn't care about these other elements, right? So I could set this to 60 pixels, oops, not 360. And we've moved it down 60. And it's just, if we go here to our developer tools, it looks like it should be where it's at, right? So, and what I mean by that is it looks like it should occupy that space, but it really doesn't. Now, if I take off the absolute positioning, it goes back to where it was at. But otherwise, these elements just scrunch up, right? For all intents and purposes, this div does not exist in this set of other divs, right? It's absolute, it's been pushed to the front, and it's going to be positioned over everything else. So outside of a pop-up window, does anyone have any ideas of what could be a good option? Like, why would we want to use absolute positioning? A slider? What do you mean by a slider there? I'm curious. Let's see what other ideas we may have. So the thing I'm thinking of is if you were to design like a game in JavaScript, you could use the absolute positioning to move the element around the screen, right? Again, I've never actually gone into that specific of a uh, JavaScript isn't necessarily a gaming language, but that could be helpful. Let's see. So like under the menu, a slider with different pages, I can scroll through left and right. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I could see that being really helpful there. Mohammed, I know you had mentioned to keep an ad showing at all times. So that's going to be a little different. And we're going to get into that here shortly. But I get where you're going with that. The absolute positioning might not be exactly what we want if it's going to be displaying at all times. But just, yeah, like a pop up window, right? Just this ad of, hey, click this. I get ads all the time for drum plugins because my guitarist and I are trying to figure that out. So I see that all over the place. Okay. So let's move past absolute because I think we're pretty straightforward what's happening here, right? Now, fixed is more, I think, of what you were thinking about, right? So this is something where it's completely removed from the flow, right? So it's independent, doesn't take up any space from the layout. But this is something where you really want this to be visible at all times, right? Like a nav bar, a back to the top button. Maybe you have a contact form, right? So when I order anything for my animals, I will usually go to this page here, the dubia roaches. Believe it or not, they're not super gross animals, right? The roaches, they're much cleaner than crickets. Now you see this here, this little chat bubble, that's going to be fixed, right? It's always going to be down there. If I was to use my element inspector and open this up, let's do this span. Let's see how far down we're going to have to. It's actually interesting to display block. There's going to be another style in here somewhere. Oh, yep, all the way up here. See how you kind of have to root up to figure out where it's at. So we have this div chat widget toggle. So if I took off this position fixed, it's gone. Where's it at? I have no idea. I have no idea. Oh, it's all the way down here. This big long element, right? That's what that one style does. So I put that back and we're good to go, right? So that's where this position fix is so important because no matter where I'm scrolling, it's going to be in the same spot. Now, if you notice here, like it's got a good amount of margin too, right? I like that. If I was to remove this here, it looks like there's some extra styles being added, right? There's all this stuff that's going on. Border radius, 58 pixels. Not going to go too deep into that, but this is a prime example of why we would want that position fixed. So in this example, we have a I am fixed position box that no matter how often you scroll down is always going to be the same. Now, to make it even more demonstrable, we'll go ahead. We're going to add a lot of other elements, right? Just to scroll. I don't think there's really enough elements here that we could be like, how far is this going to scroll? So I think we've got at least 100 here, right? I can just scroll for days and it's not going anywhere. Now, understanding when the right time to use position fix is important, right? This could be really annoying, not necessarily a good user experience if it's intrusive or obtuse. What I mean by that is a good nav bar should not only be minimal, but there's also going to be CSS that you could do where if you scroll, the nav bar disappears until you stop scrolling, right? Because it assumes if you're scrolling, you're doing something. And when you stop, it'll reappear and then you can make your choice from there. So position fix should not be a way to harass users. It should not be a way to manipulate users. It should just be a way to have something that's important and necessary for the user in a way that they can view it at all times, but it shouldn't be something that we are negatively affecting the customer or the client, excuse me. Okay. So as we saw in the CSS, we could go here and change our position. So it's set to 30 and 60. So how do we get that all the way to the bottom? That's a good question. So let's just do bottom 10 pixels. right? And now it's bottom pushed up. And now I could do right 10 pixels. And now we have this element at the bottom, right? So that's going to be the trick too, is understanding which properties to use to position your element. As you see here, if I want it in the bottom right, I would make the right with bottom and right. But the previous styles or previous properties were top and left. So that way it's going to get pushed from the top and the left. Okay. All right. How are we feeling, class? Does that make sense with the fixed property here? I want to make sure because we're about to go over something called float that is something that isn't used as widely. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that one. Want to make sure we can spend some time here on these core concepts. Cool. Diego, Chris, Sarah. Awesome. Looks like we're feeling good. So, oh, Mohammed dropped something there in the chat. I think I always see fixed position in most websites. Yeah, I mean, it's something that is going to be used pretty often. So let's think about a website that a lot of us use, Amazon, for example, right? Now here, you don't necessarily see a whole lot that's fixed, right? Because, well, that's just it wouldn't really make sense to have the board, I guess the nav bar on this one fixed because you can do a lot of what you want down here. But what we could try doing is let's see if we can actually set this to fixed. Okay, so let's do display fixed important. And it's gonna tell me it's invalid. All right. Oh, position. Why did it do display? Okay, so now I scroll down and I can make it fixed, right? It's fine. But again, I wouldn't say it really benefits the flow, right? Because you know what you're going to do. You're going to go on here and click an item. But if we go to a different site, like, does anyone have any suggestions? Looks like they said something about Facebook chat boxes. Let's see. What about eBay? Yep. So we have this little help down here. And that's kind of been my experiences. You tend to see that more often than not is more of a support thing where you're wanting to encourage people to, whether it's sales or anything else, it's kind of keep that in your line of sight. Okay. So floats and clears. A float is going to allow you to align an element to the left or the right within that block. Okay, so now different elements are going to be able to wrap around them. So I like the example they have here because ultimately all of these terms, right, came from somewhere else. It's an analogy. So it's similar to a boat floating to one side of the river, right? And then the water is going to flow alongside it, which is the other content. So to do this, we're going to use either float left or float right. And this is typically where you would see text being wrapped around images, different multi-column layouts. But in doing this, it's going to disrupt the flow of that document. So that's where we have to understand clear, because if we have an element that floats to the left, well, now all of a sudden everything on the right is going to be adjusted. So the clear, what that does is it's actually going to prevent those other elements from wrapping around. Okay, so it's kind of like an element. It's a barrier. It's a dam that's going to stop that flow of content. And honestly, a lot of this just doesn't make sense until we can take a look here and see what's happening. Okay, so if we look at the actual HTML stuff, I'm going to go ahead and uncomment or comment out all of this. So this is what it looks like really without CSS. Okay. Now, if we want the floated box, oh, I see what I did there. I'll uncomment this out. If we want the floated box and we don't use the clear, you'll see that everything is wrapping around that, which actually it doesn't look horrible, right? I mean, it is something that, if you have like a page where it's a bio of someone, right? And you have the image and you want that text around that person, this is a great way to do that. You don't have to add a lot of CSS. What we're saying is everything, well, this element should float to the left. We're giving it width and height of 100 pixels, and that's really about it. We give it a little bit of margin, the text line, right? It's pretty straightforward. Now, the issue with this is if I uncomment this, but then take out the clear on this clear box, well, this isn't good, right? So we actually have this background color that's going in the entire width of the container as it should, but it's going behind that floated box. That's not what we want, right? I don't know anyone who would sign off on that and be like, oh, nope, that's perfect. Fine, leave it as is. Not just the color scheme there, but you don't want that floating behind it. So that's where this clear comes into play. So now, if I hit refresh, you'll see that it actually now is on its own line. Okay. So if I change this to clear right, doesn't work because we're clearing to the right. So now what I could do, let's uncomment this. Let's do float right. Okay. So we have the same problem. The background's going behind here. The box is floating to the right. Okay. That's not what we want. So if we do clear right, what we're saying is, hey, let's stop everything if there's a float to the right. So now it's on its own line. Okay. Again, this layout isn't very practical. I don't think of any instance where you may want this, but what it's saying is we can make sure that this element can clear past any floating elements so that there's not a conflict. The float can do what it needs to do, and then this element will be on its own line, so there's no conflict. Okay. Now, again, this is not something that's used often, in my opinion. I'm not sure if I've ever used it in a production environment, but I have jumped into a lot of different projects over the years, and I've seen this because you may want to manually adjust an element. Again, with the way that this worked, like let's just imagine that clear box isn't here. Like layouts like this are not uncommon, right? If you were to go to any company, I'm thinking of like a startup company. Man, why can I not think of a bio right now? Should have been more prepared on that. So, but that's a pretty normal format, right? Is to have an element and then text wrapping around it. So this would be one of the ways where you could do that. Tomorrow we're going to learn about Flexbox. I would argue that's going to be an easier way to do that, but this here will at least give you the ability to adjust your elements the way that they need. Okay. So we're about an hour, 10 minutes in at this point. After this, we do have a lab that we're going to give you some time to go over. Okay. So why don't we do 10 minutes, and then before we do the lab, we can go ahead and revisit a few things before we jump into that. So if there was anything in particular you would like to review about the box model, sizing or positioning, let's go ahead and throw that in the live chat. And then when we come back in 10 minutes, we'll revisit those concepts, and then we'll go ahead and lay out the landing page. I don't know who wants to run the music, but man, that timer just triggered something like primal in me, and it just, I don't know what it was, but did not like that. Did not like that. All right. So before we start, I have to ask, is anyone here familiar with cotton candy grapes? Because I have never liked grapes in my life, ever, until I had these. And like it has just opened up a new world for me. It's surreal how good these are. And then now I like other grapes. So I don't know. I'll stack it on that. Okay, so I didn't see anything here in the chat, so I don't know if maybe it was brought up elsewhere, but is there anything we would like to reiterate and go back over before we jump into the lab here? And frozen grapes, no idea. I've never had that. I'll have to try that. I think honestly, I never gave grapes a chance because I didn't like raisins. I like raisins and trail mix now, but that's about as far as I can go. All right, so I'll give another second here in the chat, see if anyone has anything they would like to touch on. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and jump here into the lab, give everyone a chance to work on that. And then we also kind of want to open it up to maybe you're done with the lab. This would give you an opportunity to keep working on the project as well and get some live support, whether it's from me, Veronica. So let's see. I just see Timo saying those grapes are awesome. And yeah, they really, really are. Like, I don't know how they spliced cotton candy DNA with grapes, but it's awesome. Obviously, I'm joking. So let's go ahead and look at the lab. We've created a preview here for you. So what we're going to do is take the box model and talk about floats, clears, and we're going to be designing a landing page for this fictional startup called Cloud Innovate. It is not going to be called Cloud Strike. I think that's a little too soon, although that was the first thing I thought of when I saw this. So the goal for this layout, we're going to be able to position the elements to understand, we're going to create this layout, right? But we're going to be using these different position properties to understand how we could create a layout without using something like Flexbox. And then we're also going to use the float feature to style the elements horizontally, creating a little bit more of that dynamic layout. Okay. So like we did last time, I'm going to reiterate, or I guess go over what the steps should be. And then it's going to be your job to take the existing CSS and make what we saw here in this preview. Now, as always, the answers are in the drop downs here, but our suggestion is try it on your own, see how far you can get, and use those as a resource to get yourself unstuck. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is make the nav bar fixed, as we see up here. Even though you're not seeing that technically at the moment, we want to have that in a fixed position. So we'll take the header section, set it to fixed, set the property of the header to 0, and then set the width to 100%. After that, we're going to add some border styles for the feature cards, and then we're going to arrange the feature cards, right? It's going to give you all the steps here. And at this point, we should be able to have the layout that we see here in the image. So let's go ahead. Really, we've got a bit of time here. Let's work on that. And then again, we want to utilize this time to go over some project as well, give you some time to work on that. If you have any questions or you'd like some feedback, you can always message us directly as well, and we can go over that. Okay. All right. So it looks like the majority of you were able to get through the lab, which is awesome. So let's go ahead and let's go through this. Okay. And then if we have any questions, of course, please drop those in the chat as always. Or if you need more assistance, you can reach out in the extra help channel as well. All right. So first step here is we want to make the navbar fix. Okay. So as we see, we can locate the header selection in the CSS file, which here we're not going based on a class, we're doing an element selector. Now, to confirm that we're doing the right thing, we could always change like the background color, for example, right? So let's change that to, pale goldenrod. Oh, yep. So we know we're in the right spot. Awesome. We'll change the color back. And now we want to set the position of the header to fixed. So if you remember, we'll set position, and then we would write fixed. Okay. Now, yeah. So obviously we've got other things we need to do, right? But this is where, doing one thing at a time can be helpful, but also remember that if it's not the finished product, don't freak out. So now we want to set the top property to a 0. Okay. We'll do top of 0. So that's going to move the header back up top. And then also we need to set the width, right? So as of right now, we've reset the width and the height just to be baseline. So now we can go width, not width of 100%. And I know there's not a lot of content here, so you might be like, well, how do I even know it works? We could always just add some test stuff in here, right? So let's do a p tag. Let's do lorem of 50. That's going to be a lot of text. But I can scroll down here and I can see that the header is fixed. Okay. So step 1, or I guess the navbar fixed, we're good to go. Okay. Any questions about that? Seems like looking here, I didn't notice anything off in the screenshots. So the border style should be pretty straightforward as well. We're going to take the feature card class, which was already created for us, and we're going to give it some bordering. Okay, so it's 1 pixel solid of DDD, this gray color, but let's change it up. Let's do 2 pixels solid, and let's just do black to make sure that it works. Okay. So you see here, why didn't it work? Well, I left the pound sign on, right? So I'll refresh. We're good to go. There is no pound sign black color. So always make sure you're doing that correctly. We can see here that the 2 pixels solid is going around our feature card element. Now, let's say we wanted to add a border to everything. Does anyone remember the selector that we would use if we wanted to add that border to every element on the page? Kind of a deep cut here. It's not something we'd use very often, but it is something that you will still see from time to time. Yeah, there we go, the asterisk. Okay, so if I was to do that, let's see how we are ruining this web page. Yep, looks great, right? I don't know if you guys have ever checked out the it's a YouTube channel. It's like There I Ruined It or something like that, but it does all these different songs, and that's kind of how I feel about that selector right there. Okay, so we'll add that back to our feature card, and really it's kind of overdone. But I wanted to show you an actual example of what I was trying to do earlier. So let's do CSS shadow. So there is a really nice website that I have used from time to time. I'm going to share this here in the resources. So box shadows can be overused. but I think they can also be very helpful. So this website here gives you a bunch of pre-made box shadows that you can just copy and paste. And the thing is with with box shadows, this isn't like copyrighted, right? I mean, no one can copyright a CSS style like this. Now, it's different if you make like a design with CSS, that's a little different. But just like a property in itself, you can't really do that. So what's interesting here is you can actually see like where the CSS comes from. This style is from what's called Material UI. This one here is Tailwind. So let's do, I saw one earlier that I liked. Yeah, let's do that one. So we'll add this property here. So you see this very complex box shadow value that I would never be able to come up with on my own. And let's actually remove the border. Right, so that's an interesting style. You know, it's not something you see very often. But again, there's always going to be resources out here if you want to try different things. Like I cannot stress it enough. Just go on Google, search for things, try things out. That's how you're going to learn how all these different properties and values work. So what I'm going to do is let's do border radius of 8 pixels, and then we'll move on to the next thing. Yeah, I like that. Cool. So we've added the border styles, right? And then I took them off because, yeah, I'm going to make that executive decision here. But this is the kicker, right? Is figuring out how do we move these cards horizontally using floats. So it's saying here that we should apply the float property to each feature card and that it should align left. So since we're targeting a class, we only have to do this once, right? We'll just do float left. And will it do anything? Ooh, yeah, it does. Doesn't look great, right? But we're not done. So now we want to set the width to 30%. We'll do width of 30%. Okay, so I mean, we're getting there, right? But not really what we want. We're just saying, hey, make each of these cards 30% of the parent container. So it's scrunched up together. And now we want to set that margin to 1%. And the thing about percentages to remember is it's all going to be based on the viewport, right? So if I was to open this up in a new window, you'll notice this 1% margin is much different than this 1% margin because it's all based on the window size. Okay, so that's where percentages can be really helpful, but it can also be really confusing too if you're not paying attention to being understanding it's going to be relative to the size of the container and the screen, and that could change based on the size of the window as well. Okay, so we've set that margin there, and now we're going to add a clear fix div after the feature cards in your HTML. Okay, so what it's saying is now we want to add a div after all of these features with a class of clear fix. Now, it may not specify here, like, hey, you should add a class. That's where this instruction here would be helpful, right? So we'll do div dot clear fix. Oops, hit tab. Now, the thing is here, we're just applying a style, right? So we don't actually have to have any content in this div, which is not uncommon. Oftentimes you'll just see a div where like this alone, I'll show you something here in a second. But let's just go ahead and add that clear fix first. Clear fix class, we'll do clear both. And there we go. So now we have everything horizontally, looking pretty well structured, right? So since we have some time, I wanted to show you a couple things first. So first is we're going to have things that are called pseudo classes. Eventually we'll get into that. But what I want to show here is, I'm going to comment out this box shadow, or I'm going to copy it out, okay? So as of right now, it's just a white container, okay? What we could do is we can add what's called a pseudo class, okay? And what we're going to do by this is we'll do dot feature, we'll do colon hover, oops, not hover, and I want to add this style on here, okay? So what happens is when I hover over each of these elements, it will actually apply that property that I'm putting in here. Again, we're going to go over this, but I want you thinking ahead through this is how some of this reactive or conditional styling can happen. But this is what you'd actually see fairly often, right? Is you hover over, and then maybe now you could do a cursor, a pointer, right? So this would demonstrate your mouse would change over each one, right? So neat little thing that as you get ready to work on project 2 would be a nice touch, right? Trying something like that. But more than that, let's add a, it's not going to look good, but let's add a div here and we're going to call it, give it a classic shape, okay? So here on this page, we don't see anything, right? It's just a div, a container with a class of shape. So now what I can do, shape, width, pixels, height, pixels, position, 6, top, 100 pixels, left. Actually, let's do what's on the bottom. Bottom, 100 pixels, right, 100 pixels, border radius, 50%, background, color, oops, yellow. So this isn't necessarily anything that we haven't done already outside of like the border radius, but just remember that a div is just a generic element, okay? A div doesn't even have to be a container, right? You could use a div in this instance where there's no content, but now with CSS, I've created a little circle, right? And just to demonstrate that, now I can do shape, hover, background color is green, right? Not very functional, but just remember a div, again, is a element. There's a lot you can do with these. And this is where when I brought up that CSS website the other day of that person who just makes absolutely outstanding art with CSS, that's largely what she's doing is she's just taking divs and spans and applying styles to restructure and to create different elements like this. So really like let your creativity work with CSS because this is where you can get some absolutely amazing things, and it really doesn't require programming knowledge, right? This is where CSS and HTML are going to be different than your JavaScript. So there's a lot of resources out there into how you can use CSS to really spruce up your designs. But as we've seen here, all we've done is added that float to our feature cards. We added that float left, and then we made sure that everything after this is going to clear on both the left and the right. Okay, because if we just did clear left, it refreshes, we're not going to see anything because it's being finicky with me. But now if we take out the clear at all, you see it kind of bumps up here, right? Because this card isn't as tall as the others. So the contact us is trying to get squeezed in here underneath that div. So that's where it's really important that we are utilizing that clear. Now, if we would have structured this a little differently, if we just cleared left, it would have actually looked a lot worse. But with everything already being divided out, it didn't make a huge difference there. So keeping that in mind, we have a little bit of time if anyone has any questions about this exercise or the project. So if we could just throw up a poll here, see how we're feeling before we end. Because obviously we wanted to make sure to give you as much time to work on the lab and the exercises, but we do want to open this time up as well if anyone needs some extra assistance. And obviously the question, move on to the next content section would be end class, right? We don't have anything after this. Okay. So I am seeing one response here of saying not understanding the content at all. I understand you may not want to share that publicly, which is totally okay. So would you be willing, obviously I'm not asking you to speak out, but whoever that is, would you be willing to reach out to Veronica or myself? We don't have to say who you are, but like it would be helpful to know what you don't understand. Because I've learned if one person feels like they don't understand, there's probably other people too. So if we could be able to help while we still have the time, we'd love to be able to do that.